Good afternoon, and thanks to each of you for joining us. Before you began, most of you, before we got started, had an opportunity to complete the two polls that were on the screen. And thanks for doing that. We just wanted to know a bit about you as we prepare for our webinar. And as I looked at the polls, I could see that about half of you are from Extension, the other half are from other parts of land-grant institutions, and you indicated that you have average experience with facilitating these difficult conversations. So this is really great to know because we just wanted some background before we begin. So again, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us today, and I want to remind you that this webinar is brought to you by eXtension's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Community of Practice. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with eXtension is a virtual collaboration of land-grant institutions where faculty join together to address areas of interest. In our particular community of practice, we focus on providing research and education around topics of diversity. So when we talk about diversity, we're really talking about the broad spectrum of diversity that may exist in humans. We address issues in our community of practice around workplace diversity, workplace climate, organizational development, organizational change, and civil rights. To learn more about eXtension or about our community of practice, please visit our website, and you can take a look now. We have that in our chat pod, so feel free to go to that site and learn more about us. So again, we're really delighted that we're here this afternoon, and we have three outstanding speakers with us, and they're going to be talking about how to facilitate difficult conversations. Now, as you know, our country has been in turmoil in recent months, and there's been a national conversation about race, growing out of the events of the Zimmerman case, the events that have occurred in Ferguson, events that are surrounding Eric Gardner, and other events that have occurred across our country. And even though these conversations are occurring at a national level, in many cases, these conversations need to occur in local communities where change can best be effectuated. And yet, it can be difficult to engage in these conversations in a respectful way so that problems may be resolved. In many cases, those of you in extension or in higher education are called upon to facilitate these conversations. So today, our speakers will offer a variety of approaches and strategies and tools for facilitating conversations around topics where emotions are high. Now, you're going to find that each person takes a different approach, and there is no single way or no single best way to facilitate these conversations. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. First of all, we have Noor Azizan-Gardner, who is the Assistant Deputy Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer for University of Missouri. And she provides leadership for the campus in integrating diversity and inclusion throughout the many divisions of the university. Our second speaker is going to be Leonardo Pizzagna, and he is the Diversity and Personnel Specialist for Michigan State University Extension. He has more than 20 years of experience in developing, teaching, and in facilitating diversity education programs. Our third speaker today is George Oconte. George is a Community and Talent Development Education Specialist with Purdue University Extension. He's a certified instructor in crucial conversations, and certainly that provides tools for talking when stakes are high. So without further ado, I'm going to move into our first speaker, and we're going to call upon Noor to talk about setting the stage for difficult conversations. So Noor, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Julie. Can you hear me, all of you, well?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Let me know if you can't hear me. I am very, very pleased that you asked me, Julie, to be a part of this really wonderful panel. And let me talk a little bit about what I plan to do. I'm going to talk first on setting the stage for difficult dialogues. And much of my work in this area started actually with the City of Columbia when we began the Let's Talk Columbia project, which is a multi-year project to talk about all the many areas of diversity. And we based the dialogue series on the study circle project and study circle style of doing dialogue. A few years later, I was part of a research group and one of the PIs as well to go after the Ford Foundation Difficult Dialogues project. And we were very, very lucky to have been funded twice for that project on how to teach our faculty to do difficult dialogues in the classroom. So given these two very different ways of doing dialogues, what I had done was to integrate both to really guide the and provide some tips, I hope, on what our participants can do as they start thinking about how do I do these dialogue programs in my respective universities and communities. So I want to start first with the group. As we're thinking about doing a dialogue in whatever form that it takes, it's especially, I think, as we are tackling with the race issues that all of us, especially in my state, Missouri, post-Ferguson, but also for many of you in the East Coast with in New York with Eric Garner, and in Los Angeles and California with the recent issues that we have had to deal with as a nation. As you think about the group that you're trying to put together to have a dialogue, I would like for you to think about first, who are the people in the group that you are putting together? Are they diverse? Are they well represented? Think about the size. Oftentimes, I think that we want to have town hall meetings, but if you are thinking about dialogue, it's good to think about breaking a very, very huge group into a dialogue group of perhaps at most 20, so you can have smaller circles within that big town hall meetings. In terms of the space design, having an auditorium is not conducive to good dialogues, I'm afraid. We have done all sorts of experiments at the University of Missouri, and I think the least productive of them had to do with having an auditorium where we had a panelist in the front and then other people in a theater-style seating. It's much, much better to really think about perhaps individuals being in a circle or around many round tables to assist in having a much more egalitarian and much more, I think, productive dialogue process. The other thing that really is very helpful when I think about the City of Columbia in terms of the early project that we did on Let's Talk Columbia, we provided refreshments for everybody who participated in the dialogue process. And that has, I think, really been a good draw. But it also helps break down, in some ways, food and refreshments really take the edge of some of the really, really very, very sometimes intractable issues that we deal with. And then my pet I would say advice, especially in the days of constant looking at your cell phones and texting, that it is probably a good idea to remind everyone that to have their cell phones either on vibrate or off, so that you have the kind of respect and understanding that we have with each other, and for people to actually really practice active listening. Okay, moving on to establishing a group. I spent a lot of time in both dialogue projects that we had to really start the first work, that is to establish trust amongst the participants. And while this may be time consuming, but it's really, really important to really spend time for the participants and the facilitators to get to know each other. And so this is a continuation of the space in terms of, are you providing safe space for everybody there? It's really important to establish that in establishing trust for the participants. As a facilitator, many of you, I think, are in that role. I would suggest that the facilitators really perform the role of a guide rather than a sage. And it's very difficult for many of us in higher education environments to do that, but really restrain yourself from being a sage and really be more of a guide so that you can start instilling group pride in being able to be a part of the solution and the process, and to provide ownership for the group. There has to be, in the trust building stage, the ability for us as facilitators to build mutual vulnerability, and I think that the other speakers will say a little bit more about that. I would also like to really mention, as you're establishing trust, is that build the notion among the participants that nobody has the answer to all the difficult questions, but together we can perhaps become much more aware and in many cases come up with an answer or answers together. The idea of mutual responsibility for the process and the product of the conversation and the means and ends of the dialogue is critical. If you are the facilitator, ask evocative questions that are simple, clear, open-ended, agenda-free. This is really important, that agenda-free, and be direct and directly relevant to the topic being discussed. I'm going to move on now to the notion of moving on after you establish trust to really talk about why you're there. What is the outcome of the dialogue? What are we here for? It's very important to establish that ahead of time with everybody there and to agree on why we are there. What's the purpose of us being here, all of us together? What is it that we hope to accomplish together? How do we hope to bring the conversation and the product of the conversation into the work that we do afterwards, if at all? So everyone there has to agree on what the outcome of the dialogue is about. Now, the first thing that really has to be established in all the dialogues that have been really, really effective that I have facilitated or be a part of starts with establishing ground rules. These are some of the ground rules that we have used in the past in the work that we have done. We start with it's definitely a no-brainer to not have name calling, to show great interest, genuine interest, and honest interest, both verbally and non-verbally on what others are saying. This is where the cell phone comes in. It's really seriously not okay to be checking on your cell phone if somebody else is talking, because that really shows that you don't care non-verbally about what the other person is saying. And it's really important for it to be verbally and non-verbally to show real interest. I think that many of the other speakers will address the notion of being generous about yourself and being generous to others at all times without exception. Another really important notion is to attribute the best motive. It's really important that we assume that the other person has the best intention, and to also be the same with yourself as you're speaking as well, to really, really start with a good faith effort for all participants involved. One of the ways that is really, really helpful is to always speak for yourself and not for some group. I remember in one of the dialogue groups that we had, when we had an individual who was male, we had this discussion, I think, about gender disparity. Talk and be an ally and advocate for women that this person was passionately advocating about. And there was a lot of really, really uneasiness amongst the women there while he is being an ally, but he is speaking for them. And I think that was something that they express really great uneasiness about. So, these are some of the things that we have come up because of that. It's also good to affirm what others are saying in conversation. I think that you just say, that's an interesting point. I want to say that, I really see what you're saying. But another way to elaborate on that, it's wonderful to hear that from another person and to really be able to see what you're trying to illustrate in the conversation. These are just some examples. One of the best ways to make sure that you invite the group to add more to the ground rules together. And at the end, after you've established the ground rules, I would encourage that you get agreement from everyone in the group before you proceed with the actual dialogue or conversation. And everybody is in agreement that these are the ground rules that we're going to follow when we're doing the dialogue. One of the most important things that all of us are doing right now is to start having really critical, deliberate and intentional, sensitive and aware conversations about race. And this has really, I think, been a very, very important topic for all of us in higher education, in K through 12, but also in the community as well. And what my office has done very early on at the beginning of last semester, after the Ferguson incident, was to develop a talking tips, a cheat sheet, so to speak, on how to talk about race. And you can see that as a PDF that you can download from your screen, and I just want to bring attention to that. These are just tips that my team has put together based on their professional and lived experience, and also from colleagues that they have taught around the country, and also from publications that we have been able to put together to develop these tips. And if you want to have more conversations with me about this, you are most welcome to email me, talk me. You can actually talk about, send the list of questions to the facilitator of this webinar, and I will be very happy to elaborate more on any of the tips that we have developed. But in the interest of having time for my other facilitators, I think that I will end my part of the webinar today and take this back to the next facilitator or to Dr. Middleton for her to pick this up and bring it forward to our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Noor. These were definitely some excellent ideas. I'm looking here. I'm going to be looking at the chat pod from time to time for questions, because we really want to make sure that this is an interactive session. And Leonardo has some questions. He says, is the process being described connected to organized talking circles? So can you answer that question, Noor? The difficult dialogue process that you described.
So if you recall, many years ago, we have a National Study Circle project, which was developed by the National Study Circle project in Washington, D.C., and it's called Study Circle Project. So the early work that we did in the city of Columbia was based on the Study Circle process of doing dialogues. In the Difficult Dialogues project, we actually used the deliberative dialogue process which comes actually out of community development in rural sociology.
Thank you. And that question was actually from Eduardo. So thank you for that question. Jan has said that she did not see the PDF. Jan, it is at the top left-hand corner of your screen, and it says Talk About Race. And you can download it right there. Okay, very good. Thank you. Any other questions for Noor before we move forward? All right, we have 25 in attendance at this time, and so we're going to be moving forward with Leonardo Pizzagna. And Leonardo is going to be talking in more detail about facilitating those difficult conversations. Welcome, Leonardo.
Thanks a lot, Julie, and thanks to all of you that are on this webinar this afternoon. I want to just put into context that much of the work that I have done over the past 20 or some odd years has been in work as a student development professional, and then also working for MSU Extension here in Michigan. And it draws from a lot of different ways of engaging people in what I would identify as transformative education, getting people to be able to see beyond what they might be experiencing in the moment, to see how they might be able to have agency to transform themselves personally, the institutions that we work for, and the communities that we live in. So I want to also mention that any of these conversations related to inclusion and equity, or around race, or around other forms of differences, can be difficult. And what I want to highlight, and they can be very joyful and joyous. I continue to want to make sure that people know that entering into these conversations, because of the lack of having the conversations, oftentimes make it difficult. But on the every time that I've had the opportunity to facilitate or engage in these important conversations, they've also brought me much joy. So I just want to say that, because there's times where I have to remind myself about that. So one of the things that I want to start out with is by supporting what Noor said earlier about the need to have guidelines. And I'm showing you now a list of guidelines that I use in a lot of work that I do. And I've got a couple of them highlighted that I think are most important, or are raised to a level of importance when we're looking at difficult conversations across race and other differences. The first one is the practice both and thinking. And the way that I share that with participants is really this particular guideline allows us to be able to hold the complexity of people's lives and experiences in a way that honors everybody, because as Noor said earlier, nobody has the only or the right answer, but working together we can find the ways in which we can find solutions, and we can find healing in this process. And so practice both and thinking really asks us to say that there may be 20 people in the room that are in this conversation, and there may be 20 perspectives, and they all have validity, and our work is to hold those with sacredness and with validation as a way of working against oftentimes this binary, true, false, yes or no, right or wrong, dichotomous thinking that oftentimes enters into our heads or into our processes when we're dealing with complex issues. So that's one of them that I would just highlight as a possibility to use with groups. Another one is to be aware of intent and impact. And what this allows me to think about is the fact that if I make a mistake, or if I take a risk, and the risk is one that offends or has a negative impact on somebody in the circle or in the dialogue, my work in that moment is to hear what the impact is. Because too often in these conversations that are complex or difficult, there can be a lot of energy put into what my intentions were. I'm a nice person. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I didn't mean to say what I said. And again, what that does is take away the opportunity to hear the impact on the individual that oftentimes is in that target group, or maybe a person of color, or maybe a woman, or maybe a person of a different gender identity or sexual orientation. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn if we hear what the impact is. And in too many cases, our energy goes to hearing what the intent is. And so, again, I would just offer those two guidelines as helpful or important ones that have been a part of my work around difficult conversations. And again, reiterate the importance of setting guidelines or agreements that the group would tend to during the conversations, during the dialogues, and use those as a way to hold yourself accountable as a facilitator and the group, so that it's not your job necessarily as a facilitator to only be the only person holding people accountable. We can do that through the use of guidelines for everybody. The second thing that I would say is when I'm facilitating these dialogues, I have been in the process of just trying to understand what can I do, and I think the best that I can do is to try to create an inclusive and welcoming environment that is supportive and challenging. And for me, I've spent a lot of time thinking about, is it my role or can I provide safety for everybody? And I've come to the conclusion myself that I can't, but I do believe as a facilitator that I can provide an inclusive and welcoming environment, and I can allow people and inform people that it's going to be supportive of wherever they are in the process, and also challenging to help to move us all forward. And the ways that I have successfully been able to do that or tried to do is to invite participants to bring their whole selves to the dialogue. So when we're in conversations, I'm going to isolate this to the conversation around race. When I enter into this conversation around race, people may only be able to see me or make assumptions that they're seeing me as a person of color, as a Latino entering into this dialogue. But along with being a Latino, I enter into this dialogue with a whole set of privileges as a male, as a heterosexual, as a person with formal education, and so on. That is also a part of what I'm going to bring into the dialogue. And so even though we may be looking at conversations around race being about race, we need to know that the facilitators and participants bring a lot of other identities that help to bring complexity to the dialogue. And so our invitation, I would say as a facilitator, is to let people know that we want you to bring your whole self. And part of bringing our whole selves also means that we invite participants to be aware of and to bring into the room their feelings and their emotional and social intelligence. One of the things that I think can be very harmful in difficult conversations is to say directly or indirectly in the way that we facilitate that we're going to try to leave emotions out of it. I think that's one of the core ways in which we maintain oppression, is by leaving emotions out of these difficult, complex conversations. And so I think it's our job as facilitators to welcome the range of emotions that might happen, from people being angry and sad to people being joyful and powerful and peaceful. And so part of that may be that I may intentionally, as a facilitator, provide some information about feelings and emotions, or just to, at the very beginning, make sure and ensure people that we are going to allow you to bring all of your emotions, and allow there for being a space if any questions come up about what does that mean. But I think it's just important that we're implicit about making sure that feelings and emotions and social intelligence is welcome in these circles. The other thing that I hear a lot when I'm in these conversations or facilitating them is, Leonardo, is dialogue enough? Is dialogue action? And what I would say is that it's important to acknowledge that dialogue is action often, because we haven't had a long history of talking about these important issues. And I would add to that we also need to think about action steps in partnership with others different from ourselves as part of the dialogue. So again, here's one way to implement the both and guideline, is that oftentimes dialogue, it might be the first step, and that it hasn't even happened for us to get to the second part of developing action steps or action plans in partnership with others. Because too often after these dialogues, or sometimes after these dialogues, let me say, people get excited and they want to go right into action and then begin to repeat ways in which people with a lot of privilege take over processes. And so it's really a moment of us being able to settle down and saying, how are we going to create action steps together? So another piece of information that might be helpful for you, and I oftentimes use this slide and present this information at the beginning of a dialogue to allow people to know that there's different ways that we can converse with each other. And one way is what might be seen as a conventional process, a debate process where there's one right answer, or the goal is to be right or to persuade. And you can see the other components of this conventional process. And I'm not here to say that that's a bad process. It can be helpful in some ways. You know, we use it in our political processes. We use it in ways to maybe try to deal with difficult situations. But what I'm finding in this conventional process is that it's about my truth, and my truth being better than everybody else's, and I'm going to convince you of that. And that doesn't work very well from my perspective and my experience in difficult conversations. And so what I would encourage people in a dialogue to be aware of is, here's some markers for us to be thinking about if we're actually in dialogue. And that is that there would be multiple and valid perspectives with the whole group, that our goal is to understand, that my role as a participant or maybe as a facilitator is to be curious and open. And it connects to what Nora said earlier about being, as a facilitator, asking open-ended questions. And I would also ensure that you're asking some questions about how people are feeling. So you're getting individuals out of their cognitive thoughts and into their feeling and into their heart about what's happening or what they've experienced in these dialogues. I'm positioning myself to learn. I'm looking at providing the opportunity for stories to be told, because I think that's part of both the dialogue process and the healing process, because oftentimes groups that have been oppressed haven't been able to tell their stories or haven't been able to feel that their stories are validated. So I think that's important. And then the last bullet of reflecting instead of reacting. And so I'm going to stop just for a minute and see if any of you that are on the call, on the webinar, have any thoughts about the use of this slide in difficult dialogues, or how you have been able to lean into a dialogue process versus a debate process in difficult conversations. So I'll look to see if there's any questions or any examples from you related to this particular piece of information, just for a minute.
And I would invite the other presenters to add their ideas too. And I see here that there are a couple of people who are writing now. Eduardo's typing. While he's typing, I did have a question about a previous slide, Leonardo.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned the importance of a person bringing all of their emotions with them. And I was wondering, how do you keep these emotions from getting out of control, or how do you mitigate these emotions in those dialogues?
Yeah. Well, here's what I would say, Julie, and I don't know that it's a perfect answer, because I don't know if there's one, but what I would say is that in the role of a facilitator, it's really important for you to be connected with and aware of your own emotions, because in those times when the emotions get high, it's a really wonderful moment in the conversation. And if I'm not comfortable as a facilitator with that, then I may see my role as trying to shut that down or trying to minimize it. And I actually think that my role as a facilitator is allow it to happen, to provide support to the person wherever they may be in that place of sadness or anger or rage or whatever, and ensure that people are able to feel like they're protected. That the person isn't lashing out at somebody. I would if they were, I would take them back to one of the guidelines. But I think unless I'm feeling pretty good about my understanding of my own emotions, I can kind of ride that wave with the participant as long as nobody's being hurt, and try not to shut those emotions down, because I think that's sometimes a reaction in those moments.
Thank you. I see that there are a couple of questions in the chat for you, Deonardo, if you'll look at those.
Yeah, Eduardo, I think that what you're saying is right on task, Eduardo, as far as oftentimes our desire to be specialist or to be unbiased facilitators tends to lead us towards more conventional processes. And I think if we can lean into understanding that we're co-learners in the process in facilitating these dialogues, that we can still hold on to our knowledge, and not, that doesn't weaken our knowledge. It just says that we don't have all the answers, and our goal isn't necessarily to have all the answers. That I trust the group, and the wisdom will come from the group. And that's a really hard, sometimes a very hard thing to navigate as a person who has multiple degrees and has a specialist title and wants to do a good job. So it is complicated, and I think even more complicated for those of us working in higher ed. Yeah, and Elizabeth, I would say your comment is right on point also, because any of the ways that we are in community with others, this process of understanding can be very helpful. So if it's mentoring or if it's coaching, and I think one of the jobs that we have as facilitators of these processes is to really work on our listening skills, because I know when I'm facilitating these conversations, I have an opinion and I have something to say and I have experience, but if I can slow myself down and put myself in the process of being a listener, I think I can be a more effective facilitator of these difficult conversations. Thank you for those comments and questions, and I just quickly want to get through some of these other points and hand things off to Charles. So Nora talked about focusing on building trust, and I think that's really, really important. And one thing that Nora didn't point out, but I think it's something that we can do to build trust, is to greet people when they walk in and make connections with people, because that might help to alleviate some feelings of anxiety or feelings of not knowing exactly what's going to happen. So as friendly as you can be and as inviting as you can be, I think that's helpful to build trust. As Nora mentioned, do purposeful introductions. Spend time to get to know the participants, and don't be too quick to try to get to the issues, because you're going to get to them, and you might even get to them in the introductions. And what I would say along with this is these conversations take time, and so you may want to think about making sure you have enough time, and also that you might want to bring the group back multiple times in order to get to the point of the purpose of the dialogues, or even resolution or action steps. As a facilitator, I think it's really important to practice vulnerability, to share your own stories, and to see yourself as a co-learner, and maybe even lead with that, so that you're not, again, putting yourself there as the expert, but actually as a co-learner on your own journey. it's important, I think, to encourage interaction early in the process, and so part of that is you might be able to achieve that through introductions, but you want to give some background information, but if you can get people interacting with each other early on, I think that helps to break some of the ice and break some of the anxiety that may or may not be in the room. It's important to honor people where they're at, encourage no blame, shame, or attack of others or of self. And I think that that's something we have to be aware of as facilitators, that oftentimes there's a lot of messages that lead us to go to shame of ourselves, and just to honor the fact that there are ways to maneuver out of that, but to make sure that people aren't shaming or blaming others or themselves. What I continue to learn this and tell myself this, but oftentimes fail, of knowing that less is more. So when we're putting an agenda together, there may be a lot of things that we want to accomplish, but if we can slow ourselves down and know that if we give people time to dialogue and be in conversation with each other, that those benefits will be just as beneficial as if I pack the agenda tight and get to a lot of things. So it's been I keep on telling myself that less is more, and usually that turns out to be the case. Understand that there's going to be trigger events during the dialogue, that somebody may say something, or one of the exercises or whatever you use as the dialogue process for your group may trigger some things for participants and for you. And I would just say that it's been my gift to learn that these processes are trauma-informed, because oftentimes, things come up that are really traumatic for us, or we hear things that are very traumatic for us, and we just have to be aware of tending to the group and tending to ourselves. It's also important to be comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. It may be the most uncomfortable thing at the end of the dialogue is that everything isn't, all tied up into a nice, complete process. But I can be comfortable that I led a process that ended where it was supposed to end. And then the last thing is to create a serious and a joyous learning environment. So be able to acknowledge that these issues are serious and they're things that are tearing our communities and individuals in our communities apart, and that we can find joy in being together and dialoguing about these complex and serious issues. And so how do we tend to both the seriousness and the joyfulness of these conversations? So I've gone over my time a bit, and I want to hand things over now to George, who will lead the next segment of our conversation.
And before we begin with George, let me make sure there are no other burning questions for Deonardo. I certainly appreciate those of you who put questions in the chat box, and I encourage you to have those continue. We really want this to be interactive, and we'll now move on to George. Welcome, George.
Hello, welcome. Welcome. Thank you very much for allowing us to have this conversation at this time. My name is George Ocante. I work here at Purdue Extension. I'm kind of seeing a lot of very interesting colleagues over here. I was on the National Diversity Task Force where we actually came up with a document of diversity reaffirmed. And I can see Eduardo is online. I see Paul Morris, and I see Julie with the Change Agent States for Diversity. So this work has been going on for quite a while, and I am so delighted that I'm still connected with this work. So I'm really looking forward to a good time. I work here in community development. I do a lot of trainings here related to diversity, inclusion, and especially to do with having difficult conversation. So the trainings that I tend to do focus more on crucial conversations, tools for talking when the stakes are high. Now, I'm going to be drawing most of what I talk about today around these lessons, but I'm also going to be drawing on, the Harvard negotiation group with difficult conversation. So I'm going to be drawing on two resources to kind of advance most of what I have to do here. Okay, so I just want to give us a context here, and the context really just came very recently, and this is from James Comey, from the FBI director. And, you know, although he denies that there's an epidemic of racism among American law enforcement, he actually admits to some level of cynicism and unconscious bias by the nation's cops. Now, the part that is really very instructive is that he really encourages us to really start a discussion about the relationship between law enforcement and the diverse communities that they serve. I think this is very, very important, and that kind of, reaffirms, what we are doing right now. And what he basically did, and I think Julie mentioned that earlier in the beginning of this webinar, the issues to do with the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson. He also mentioned, Eric Garner, Staten Island, and then he also talked about the two NYPD officers who actually were shot. Now, what he said was that the rift between minority communities and officers of the law cannot be ignored any longer. So there's a crucial conversation and there's a difficult conversation that we've been ignoring for a very long time. And it's so